All right, let's start. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Amma ba'd. So last time we were discussing about Orientalism, which was basically a collection of knowledge, studying a different culture, a region, their religion, their society, and everything involved in it to get a feel of the ground reality over there so that can be exploited in order to control it. And that controlling project, which was a result of Orientalism, is what we know as colonialism. So first of all, we can define colonialism and another related term, imperialism, talk a bit about the difference between them. We'll talk about the historical development of the colonial project. And when we talk about colonial project, we mean the European colonial project, because by definition, uh, their colonialism has been going on since the dawn of time. And lastly, we'll talk about the colonial roadmap, what they planned and at which stage they are right now, and what are their future plans. And afterwards, we're also going to talk about globalization and the missionary movement as well, inshallah. So, colonialism, by definition, is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country. And the method of doing so is you occupy it with settlers and exploit that region economically, right? So anything, any policy or any practice in which your main target is political control over another country, another region, and your method is to occupy it with settlers. So Europe, for example, would send its own people who would occupy the lands in different areas, right? Or today, the Israelites are occupying the Palestinian territories. So they're basically taking the land and installing their own people there, right? And so these are the two parts of colonialism. You'll have the aim, the goal, the target, and the method of doing that, right? And so this is where colonialism and imperialism also differ. So there's actually a physical takeover of a country's natural resources in the colonial project. As far as imperialism is concerned, there's just power projection. I mean, there's also a policy and practice to control the political situation in other area, but the method does not necessarily involve you actually physically taking it over, right? So you could exert influence over another country to do your bidding, and that would be part of imperialism, for example. The Chinese imperialism is quite famous, in which they controlled Japan, for example, but Chinese people didn't end up having their colonies all over Japan, right? So you're just controlling the other party politically. You're controlling their resources, but you don't have to be present there in order to impose your will. So that's the first difference between colonialism and imperialism. And so the second part is that there's permanent settlement of people, right? In colonialism, you're actually building new colonies over there. While in imperialism, you just need economic and political domination. And the American imperialism today, um, Africa has gold mines, but no gold reserves. All of their gold is in either Europe or America. So that's their imperialism, right? Middle Eastern countries, they have reserves of oil and gas, right? But a lot of their policies are designed around pleasing the US, for example. They can't partake in the situation in Palestine going on. They can't really do anything but talk about the problems that are happening all around the world, right? And so this is American imperialism at its finest, in which you're politically controlling the other country and you have control over their economic resources, and the whole country itself cannot benefit from it, right? But America doesn't necessarily have to be over there to make this happen. So that's the difference between colonialism and imperialism, in which their objectives are almost the same, right? So it's almost exploiting the natural resources of other nations. The way they do it, that's where the difference between the two happens, right? And so this is what colonialism is, actually taking control over another country's situation by politically dominating yourself. Now, this whole colonial project has roots way beyond our time, right? You can go really far back with this. You could actually say that this European colonial project has roots in the Khilafah era. I, at the, from the time of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, this project has started, and you can probably say that the initial stage, the preliminary stage of this, ended with the Crusade Wars, right? They basically had four objectives at that time. Number one was to end the Khilafah. Number two, to get hold of the al-Muqamat al-Muqaddasa, the religious sites, which basically meant Jerusalem because that is something which is holy according to all Abrahamic faiths. Number three, they had the intention and the goal of actually having control over this entire Islamic world. And at that time, the Islamic Empire was spread across a large geographical area. And number fourth was to actually eliminate Islam from the face of the earth and to actually uh, wipe out the Muslim identity. Right. So from the period of the Sahaba, they have been trying to do this relentlessly, right? And in 616, uh, after the Hijrah, when Genghis Khan attacked the Islamic world, and then in 656, his grandson, he actually totally annihilated the city of Baghdad, and that ended the Abbasid Caliphate, right? And in the whole scenario, in the whole picture of this happening, in when the Mongols were attacking the Islamic world, the Christian community was with them all the time because they wanted the Islamic Empire, the Khilafah, to actually end. And second of all, the Crusade Wars, we all know that the main aim of that war, but that was just the start. They would also want to control over the entire Muslim world because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed these regions with a lot of natural resources. Now, in all this period, in this preliminary era of their project, they didn't succeed. And there were three main pillars, I would say, which supported the Islamic Empire in order to combat the situation, as it were. Number one, the Muslimin, they consistently were engaged in dawah activities to the point that the Mongols, which previously had destroyed entire cities and ended the Abbasid Caliphate, accepted Islam, right? So their relentless dawah activities was their first pillar. The second thing was that although the main Khilafah was ended, but in Egypt, some of the people reinstated the Khalifa, the Abbasi Khalifa. So that kind of gave like a supporting point, a point where all the Muslims could unite, right? So they had a unity between them. And the third thing is that they were actively engaged in jihad. And like we discussed previously, not jihad in its new meaning, but jihad in the original meaning, which it was supposed to be used, right? Physical activity. So these were the three things that the Muslimin were continuously doing, which basically led to the failure of the initial colonial project. And now, after the Crusade Wars are done and they realized you can't go head on with these people, that is when their experience led them to change their strategy, not to attack them in the field of war, but rather to divert their power and their efforts towards actually trying to control their minds. So now they wanted economical and academic domination of the Muslim, right? And actually, there were four events in history which fueled this desire of theirs. First happened in 1453, Common Era, in which the Uthmani Khilafah, right, or the Uthmani Khalifa, Sultan Muhammad Fatih, he was able to liberate Constantinople and it came into Muslim rule. And this actually sparked feelings of hatred against the Muslims. And when that happened, a lot of Roman philosophers, they migrated to Europe, in which then, being philosophers as they were, began spreading this idea of colonialism on how to get control over the Muslim world and all the resources. And then in 1492, uh, Spain which was previously ruled by the Muslim nation for 800 years, now the entire control of Spain came into the hands of Europe. And so this was a factor that boosted their self-esteem and their self-confidence that they too can retaliate and get back what they said was rightfully theirs. And the fourth thing that happened is the Spani Khilafah, the Turks. What they did was they closed off the trade routes that the European countries used to use through the Mediterranean Sea, for example. And what this did, it prompted the European traders to actually find new trade routes. And this led to the discovery of America and even led to the Europeans reaching the shores of Southeast Asia. Now, by the end of the 16th century, this is actually when the real colonial period started. And the roadmap that they have was basically involving 7 steps. The first step was to be financially self-dependent. So what Europe tried to do was become financially independent and be self-sufficient in its trade, right? So this happened when the Turkish people actually stopped their path. So the first target was to find new ways in order that their economy could be independent from the Muslim world, from the Muslim trade routes, right? And so what happened was in the Spanish king Ferdinand and Isabella, the queen, uh, they wanted to explore the eastern countries from Europe. And so what they did in 1492, they sent off Columbus to actually discover uh, India. But along the way, he got lost and ended up in America, which was basically an untapped land full of resources. So that was a big win for them. And also the Portuguese king in July 1497, he sent Vasco da Gama for the same purpose, and he actually ended up reaching India in 1498. right? So this was the first thing, finding new financial and trade routes to become self-independent from the Usmani Khilafah. The second thing that they wanted to do was get an economic and military siege of the Islamic world, right? So in that same period, what happened was that the Europeans in different Islamic countries uh, brought on their armies, especially the ocean was pretty much unprotected at that time. The Muslim Khilafah and other countries did not take much account of the ocean, and so that was an area totally open for the Europeans to use, right? So, for example, in 1515, the Portuguese they were able to get control of the ports in Muscat in Oman, Hormuz and Bahrain, right? And these were basically the ports where trade used to happen with with the other Islamic countries. Spain, for example, in 1521, they reached the Philippines, and by 1565, they were able to get control of all of the land, the seashore in the Philippines. And by the end of the 15th century, about 1600, the British they took control or they came to India, right? In the form of a trading company, the East India Company. By 1664, the French also targeted India. They also sent their company over there in order to get control of the resources. And there was this struggle. It wasn't always that the entire European nation was against the Muslimin. They had infighting amongst themselves as well. But sadly, we stopped using those three weapons that we used to use, or we broke down the three pillars that we had of da'wah, of jihad, and of a single unity that all Muslim nations used to have, and that's why they were able to get control over the lands. So this was the second stage in which they wanted economic and military siege of the Islamic world, and slowly but surely, they were able to control the seas, and they got hold of the resources of most of the Islamic world. The third stage involved economic dominance. So you're not just seizing the control, but you're dominating the area of economics, right? So the international trade was now in European hands. And the plundering that they did of those countries in which they colonized is well documented in history. For example, India, for example, used to contribute 24% of the global GDP, and after the end of the British colonialism, it ended up contributing only 3%, right? So this is just one example of the reckless and ruthless hoarding and devouring of the colonial wealth done by the colonialists. The fourth stage involves the domination of the Islamic world. And so, using, for example, traders, the British were able to, in 1757, defeat Siraj ad-Dawla and ended up having the control of Bengal in 1799. They ended up having control over the area of Mysore, and by 1857 they had control over Delhi and the entire Indian subcontinent, right? It was not just the British. There were other countries involved too. It wasn't just India. For example, the British in 1851, they had control over Nigeria. By 88, they had Misr under their control. In 98, Sudan. In 1914, it was Iraq. In 1918, Urdun and Palestine were also in their control, right? And Russia, for example, in 1556, they started to grab the Muslim areas under close to them, right? And by 1696, they actually ended up reaching the borders of Turkey. So at one side there's the British going on, the other side it's the Russians taking land one by one. Then you have other colonial powers like France. In 1830, they had Aljazair, Algeria. By 1881, Tunis also came into their control. By 1912, Morocco, and by 1921, Syria. All of these countries came into the French colonialist rule. And in 1887, Italy got control over Somalia, and by 1911, it had control over Libya as well. Right? Basically, what happened is that the entire Islamic world now ended up in the hands of different European colonizers. And that's where we come to the fifth stage, which was to end the Khilafah. So basically erasing Muslim unity altogether. So the Khilafah was still present, but by 1909, the Khalifa basically lost all of his rights and options and power. So he was just a puppet over there. But after World War One, by 1924, um, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, a secularist Turk, actually ended the Khilafah on orders of the allies, and the entire Uthmani Khilafah was divided. New countries were formed, right? Palis- Palestine was given to the Jews to colonize. Syria was made another country. Iraq was made a separate country. Jordan was made a separate country. And this is a very old tactic that was used actually by Alexander the Great. So his teacher, Aristotle, actually taught him that in order for you to become a successful colonizer, what you need to do is not to actually enforce your law or yourself on the countries that you capture. What you do is you capture them, you divide them into smaller areas, and appoint people on each of those areas and name them a king. So if I'm the king of even, let's say, 25 acres of land, I won't be so easily willing to join forces with someone else and relinquish my title of king, right? So these titles and these worldly nominations have this magical power to it to influence people. And so that's what they did. Divide the countries, make them into separate kingdoms, give them a national identity, and in all of this, they're going to lose the one thing that unites them together, which was Islam. And even today, there are some issues where we come together, but for a lot of issues, there's a lot of divide between us Muslim countries, such and such that we can't even be independent in our trade. And most of our countries are sadly they sadly have military alliances with the West. So I'm going to share with you some figures of where there are American soldiers within Muslim countries. Turkey, for example, has about, so there are basically 45,000 US troops and contractors across the Middle East. Turkey has 1885, Syria has 900, Jordan has about 2,936, Saudi Arabia has 2,700, UAE has 3,500, Qatar has 8,000, Bahrain has 9,000, Kuwait, being such a small country, has actually 13,500, and Iraq has 2,500. Almost all countries have US military troops over there. The question is why? Like, why do you ever need them? Why are you so unable to defend yourself? And why could you not trust other Muslim countries to help you? Why do you need to have US military troops over there? And if you have the military, a foreign military there, it's very unlikely that your own military could ever stand against what they want. So that's the situation that we have on our hands. A divided ummah, right? And so that was ending of Khilafah, finishing that identity of unity, and then stage number six, divide the Islamic world. Now that's not what they only did. They didn't just divide the Muslim world. They made sure that this division stays in place, right? And for example, the UN. The UN is basically a platform which we have seen very clearly in the past month or so is quite ineffective in solving any of the big issues of the world. And what this UN does is basically it's helping the colonial powers in order to keep our problems unsolved. And then you have things called international laws, which seemingly are selectively applicable. They're not applied across the board. They've never been applied to America. Um, Obviously, they were invented after the main colonial project was finished, and when countries were now becoming independent, which means that all the atrocities that the colonizers did before this, they're not held accountable for that. And Israel doesn't seem to really much care about this law either, and no one seems to be, well, none of the main powers seem to be in any mood to hold them accountable. And so the selective application of these international laws are basically, again, just to apply on the Muslim nations whenever they do something which is not in line with their agenda of the colonizers or the imperialists. The other thing that they do is basically made contracts with a lot of Muslim countries, right? And now binded by those contracts, you really can't do a lot. And time after time, by different excuses, they try and attack Muslim countries. They did it with Iraq, they're doing it with Palestine, they did it with Afghanistan, and God help the people of Qatar. Uh, they're a very big target in the near future. And it also happened to Libya as well, and Lebanon. And they're attacking Iran in a similar manner. And the other thing that they do was divide the Muslim countries into blocks. So you have this Arab bloc, which is then you promote an Arab identity and give them the feeling that other Muslims from Turkey, from Southeast Asia, are basically lesser than us. So dividing into blocks would make it more difficult for them to communicate and to strategize together. That's one of their tactics. And there's so many more just like this, right? Like I mentioned about the security conditions by enrolling the US troops all over there. That's what they're doing. And of our political parties, um, most of our political parties, for example, or political situation within our countries are being determined simply by this push and pull of power, because everyone's there to keep the overlords happy, right? And whoever tries to fight them is imprisoned or killed. For example, when Libya, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, they came together, their leaders, in order to do something about this. All three of them were assassinated. Qaddafi in Libya, Shah Faisal in Saudi Arabia, and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in Pakistan, right? So they wanted to go against America and its policies, yet all three of them were murdered. And so this happens. They don't, any government there should be the one following American policy. And if you try to raise your head to go against that, you'll be put down. So that's what they did. And this is how they divided the Islamic world and have kept it divided to date. And the last thing that they're after is, of course, uh, finishing the Islamic identity, to erase it. So you have these new mufakkirin, these enlightened thinkers within the Islamic world, which present to you a deen unheard of in our ancestors, right? Uh, you'll have those people telling you that you should follow the colonial policies, America's policies, the UN's policies, Europe's policies, right? Uh, it's quite famous. You might have heard some people saying on television that Islam tells us to follow the law of the land in which you live in. Not all of the laws. That's not what Islam requires. Sure, some of them, but there are a lot of laws of that land which are contradictory to Islam. That's not something Islam would ever allow. That they take that statement and make it so absolute that Islam requires you to follow the law of the land, which kind of creates that problem. So you have such intellectuals over there trying to make those efforts. And then the different ta'wilat and the changes being made to the deen, that is something that we're fully aware of. And that, again, consistent effort in trying to damage Islamic culture, right? Trying to show it as backward or show it as being fundamental or being detrimental to society and etc. So all those different efforts that you see is to erase Islamic identity. Okay, interestingly enough, the academic domain is ruled again by the same forces. And so I came across this comment by Dr. Asad Zaman. And so he is an economist who actually studied in the Ivy Leagues. He has a PhD from Stanford, and he actually taught for 15 years at the Ivy League, right? And he says that I believe it is virtually impossible for someone in Western academia to mount a genuine dissent. The reason why is that there's a lot of ostracism that happens if you try to do anything which does not support their mainstream ideas, right? If you don't have tenure, you're probably going to be kicked out. If you do, no one's going to listen to you. And so he says that I've come to the conclusion to abandon speaking to Western academia or even Muslims belonging to Western academia. It's something to wonder. A person teaching their 15 years is telling you that they're not willing to listen, which pretty much means that the academic uh, field or the place where all the policies are coming from is being controlled by a mindset which does not allow for Islam to be there, and hence all efforts being made to erase the Islamic identity. And that is the colonial roadmap, basically. Um, they've successfully completed all 6 stages. Now they are at the seventh stage, and all their efforts are being targeted to make sure that the identity is removed. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has Himself taken the responsibility of protecting this deen, so there will always be people doing that. Nevertheless, we have to combat the efforts that they're making in order to ensure that we do what we're supposed to do. And that's basically a small summary of colonialism. Now let's talk about globalization. So globalization is basically Orientalism and colonialism 2.0. It's a new version in which now you don't no longer call them Orientalists, you don't call them colonialists, because they're not exactly doing what Orientalists did or colonialists did. Now it's a new version of the both of them, right? So when we talk about Islam being the public enemy number one of the globalization movement, we'll talk about the fields of globalization and what we should be doing in this regard. All your questions will inshallah be answered at the end. Please bear with me. So Islam is the number one public enemy of globalization, right? Because the globalization movement is basically aiming to finish all economic, cultural, social, religious, national differences between people and subjugate the entire world to one single standard. And I need not tell which single standard that is, because we know where most of the world is headed towards, right? So why is it that globalization has such a problem with Islam? So first of all, that the best geostrategic areas are within the Islamic world. Like most of the international waters, the trade routes over there go through the Islamic world. The Islamic world has a lot of natural resources. The Middle East actually being in the almost in the center of the earth connects the north and the south. So it's a very good area in which you can basically, as a base, be present everywhere else in the world. So really good geostrategic area. Number two, that they are rich in natural mineral resources, whether it's oil, it's gas, it's gold, it's coal, you name it. There's a bunch of abundance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to these countries. All the holy sites of all Abrahamic faiths are present in that location. So you have Mecca, you have Medina, and you have Jerusalem. So religiously, it's a very important place, right? And lastly, and I think the most important point is that Islam is the only religion or the only holistic philosophy and system that can challenge globalization. No other philosophy can do that. So it can challenge globalization at every stage of life, be it from the smallest family unit up to the societal institutions of politics, economy, education, whatever it is. Islam gives us an entire blueprint of how to live our lives, which is fundamentally very different from the globalization blueprint. And so that's why they have a really big problem with Islam, because it's giving them a hard time in all these places. So the fields of globalization are broadly four. You have the political, the economical, the cultural, and the social. So the political field or political globalization, America is basically the founder of that. And it happened in the South and North America, in which when the Red Indians were deprived of their land, and in the 19th century, they were literally finished or almost finished off. Then what happened was Japan, the Philippines, Cambodia, Cuba, Vietnam, Haiti, Lebanon, Libya, all of these became targets of American colonialism. And then we know in 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan were actually bombed atomically as a test. So they're testing the deadly weapons on people, right? And this new colonial mindset that America brought, it was then put into control of the Jewish population, right? And they actually used this to further their cause in different occasions. Then after 1945, the United Nations and League of Nations that was placed, and we already talked about how the United Nations has been used by these countries for their own good, right? The third is the New World Order. In 1995, it said that there was actually a conference in America which officially initiated the New World Order. Now, the New World Order is basically a conspiracy theory, but every conspiracy theory has an element of truth behind it. If you look at Western academia about the New World Order, it dismisses it as a complete conspiracy theory and says that it promotes anti-Semitism. That is at the heart of it, right? And so they try to completely debunk and reject it. But the question is, if you look at what the New World Order is, the theory of it is, and see what's happening in front of us in this world, there are a lot of questions that remain unanswered. Like the question of to what extent is this actually a conspiracy? Because a lot of the elements mentioned in that theory are being seen happening right now, right? So a person is, again, prompted to ask why. Like, why are these similarities there, right? And so this is a question that I'm leaving up to you to find out. Like, to what extent is this actually a conspiracy theory? And what are the elements of truth to it? Because again, I'm not saying that's 100% true. I don't know about that, but I'm definitely saying that it's not 100% anti-Semitic theory just to get rid of the Jews from the world. There's something behind it. They're not going to admit it. We need to do more research about it. Then you have economic globalizing. And the basic premise of that is to take the world's entire wealth and place it in the hands of a few. Right? And they took steps to ensure that. First, what they did was collect all the gold reserves from all over the world, and then basically stop trade in gold altogether. Now we trade with pieces of paper. They used to have gold reserves on their back. Now that all the gold reserves from all over the world are gone, being collected by a few countries, now they want to trade in paper, which at any point of time they're going to choose. They might choose to reverse it, and the entire world will end up with nothing, and all the gold, which is actually the basic unit of wealth, will be in their hands. And this is going to probably cause a big riot, which they don't want that. So they keep on promoting this fiat currency policies. Number two was to actually create international financial institutes. like the World Bank and IMF, or even the World Trade Organization, right? And the intent behind these institutions is to make sure that the Muslim countries and other countries, are always under their control by giving them interest-based loans and making sure that once they're unable to pay, they can enforce their policies on those countries, whether it be about their taxes, their nuclear status, uh, their foreign policy towards other countries, etc. And you might be thinking that this probably is not the intention of these institutes. What I'd like you to study is a bank. So there was actually a bank in Pakistan, basically, and in England, right? I'm forgetting the name of it. I'm so sorry at the moment. Um, I'll probably mention the name to you in the chat. And what happened was, uh, the owner of the bank would used to give loans to poor African countries free of interest, right? But because he had a lot of inside information and secrets that the Americans or the British could not do anything while he was alive. The second that they got the news that the person passed away, what they did was made a case against that bank and had it shut off. Why? Because simply they were providing interest-free loans to African countries, which was liberating them from the control of the IMF policies. I will, inshallah, mention to you the name of the bank. I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting it at the moment. And then you can look up that entire piece of history if you want to. The other thing that they do was is to establish free trade. And what free trade basically is that you are not going to stop me from coming to your country and delivering my goods in a way and a fashion which suits me. So you won't tax me extra. You won't stop me from bringing what I want to your country, right? In fact, you might even be forced to give me incentives for actually establishing trade in your country, right? And so what this usually ends up happening is people are drawn towards new things. People are drawn towards cheap things. So you're bringing a lot of cheap stuff from outside and actually hinder the local market, right? And that's when the fourth step, the multinational companies come in. Now, they have a lot of capital, which means that they can mass produce stuff. And when you mass produce something, its costs automatically go down, which makes their product cheaper and more readily available in the market, right? When something is cheap, more readily available at a consistent rate, this drastically affects the local economy. And so this free trade and these multinational companies have actually uh, reduced the economy of a lot of countries. In fact, most multinational companies, their profits are 10 times over than uh, many countries, the GDPs of many, many countries, especially in Asia and Africa, for example. Right? So this economic globalization, uh, it has, again, local economy really affected. And also unemployment has dramatically increased because of these multinational companies and trading policies. Uh, Innovative ideas are very difficult to come up with innovative ideas and have them made profitable because of such countries. What would happen is usually when someone comes up with something more creative, these companies swoop in, buy that thing, and probably end up making a lot more money than that person ever could. And again, these multinational companies, again, being owned by a few people, the wealth of the entire world is accumulating in their hands. So disaster effects of this economic globalization. Then you have a cultural globalization. And what that basically is to create this cultural appropriation and tolerance, and then use that as a platform to finish every other culture and just institute one global culture wrapped in ideas and inspired by certain ideas that we know of. So first thing that they and also like so what happened was basically so cross-cultural expression tolerance. Then there's this interfaith dialogue that usually hear about in the West, like a live and let live kind of mindset, right? In which you are supposed to give up on da'wah and let other people live as they do, and you can live as you do. Right? And that's all Islam is teaching us. And then you have emphasis on English and French, for example, as languages. And so most countries would have English or French as their second language. And these are the two main languages of the United Nations. And so you're probably, like we mentioned previously, languages are closely attached to cultures. Once you emphasize these other languages and reduce the importance of the local languages, the cultures tied to them are also going to be detrimentally affected. Lastly, we have the societal globalization. So what happened in 1979, uh, the UN introduced a bill about finishing all types of discriminatory uh, differences between men and women, which was basically to garner the trust of everyone in the world. In 94, in a conference of the UN held in Misr, in Cairo, they talked about the development of people, right? And in which they introduced this notion that sexual relations should be allowed to happen outside of marriage as well, which later on developed into this UN resolution of allowing sexuality between whoever or whatever you want, right? So homosexuality was also promoted in light of this, and early marriages were highly discouraged, etc. And then in 95, they had another conference in which, again, recommendations of prohibiting early age marriages and allowing for children to actually have, or maybe not children, but young adults to actually have free sexual relations that was introduced. And a new concept of family was introduced, which was basically that a family is built up of two people. It doesn't have to be a man and a woman. It could be two men, two women, man, woman, whatever it is, right? And also the social roles which have been going on for centuries. There was an attack on them as well. That basically, You should force women out of their homes to work like men. And so these were the kind of processes that have been and are still happening in the guise of globalization, of introducing one single entity. But the question is, what are we supposed to do? How should we fight this? Right? So first and foremost is the defensive approach that we should try to protect ourselves, our families, our children from all of this nonsense. If you're living in the West, you know the transgender wars that are happening there. So we have to protect our families, ourselves from this nonsense first and foremost. We need to build communities self-sufficient in which our people are not affected by what's going outside. We need to do that. Second of all, the media plays a big role in all of this, and we need to make sure that the media is under control. We need to have our own media stations, our own, for the back of lack of better words, influencers. So sorry, but we need to have our own influencers so our ummah can find someone to look up to protect and promote our own languages, the Arabic language especially, and not be influenced by Western languages. That is something that we need to do and should do. Um, One of the things that we're doing right now, and I hope that we continue, not be fooled by this 4-day ceasefire, which Israel has already started preaching, is the boycott of these products. So the end goal is not just boycott right now. The end goal is to boycott them completely forever and to introduce their replacements, local alternatives, and build our local economies. So that's something that we can do and should do. The other thing is get rid of this nationalist nonsense. We're not Australians, Americans, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Jordanians, Saudis. We need to become one single entity, a Muslim entity. That is what our focus should be on. And we need to understand what Islam is in all of the aspects, especially in, for example, the political aspect of what Islam is. Communism failed, capitalism is also failing, democracy is getting us nowhere, and we can see the effects of that. The world is waiting for a new system. The system is there. It's us who need to show it that it is present, capable, and ready to launch. So these are some of the things that we can do as a people. Now, very briefly, I will go over the missionary movement. I'm not going to take much time in it because although it is very relevant, this movement, it's still happening in African countries, in poor countries. This usually happens a lot, maybe not in the more well-off countries, but this is still happening, right? And the missionary movement is simply to convert Muslims or people from other faith to Christianity, right? So we talk about the introduction to history, the resources that they have, what vulnerabilities of the Muslim world they exploit, and how to counter their efforts. So the evangelization or the Christianization movement, Tabshir al-Tansir, right? Uh, and the second was forced. So this movement had two parts. First was the forced conversion of people, such that happened in Spain. The Muslims were forced to convert into Islam, into Christianity, and that would happen in Portugal, for example. This was for a certain time period. Nowadays, it's more focused on dawah, dawah of Christianity, right? And this actually started in 1537, and they had their main goals were basically to promote the Roman Catholic aqidah, the beliefs of the Roman Catholic, through the dawah activities, to actually canonize the church, and to open up Catholic schools and colleges to promote these ideas within people. Uh, the resources that the missionaries use are educational institutes, right? So in every Islamic country, in every small and big city, they probably have a missionary school present in which a lot of people, and they provide free education. So a lot of people who can't afford to go to schools normally uh, now have a chance to send their children because free education is being provided, but they always have these elements of Christianity to them, trying to promote them. Then they have the media which they used. They especially use more subtle type of media, for example, magazines and stuff. And so one of my friends had a really valid point that, there's Christian novels, like novels based on Christian ideas, but we don't have like Muslim literature, I Muslim novels, novels based on the Muslim Aqidah, right? And so that is something that they also use, like such books and magazines, novels and stuff, right? They have education expos and delegations, send it in different countries in symposiums and stuff like that, where these people are giving their lectures, trying to influence the people. One of the biggest things, the welfare services that they provide, the non-government organizations in Muslim countries. So they're providing, different welfare services, free treatment, free food, right? All these other things. And they're using that as a front to promote Christianity. And they have these spiritual gatherings in the church, right? So communal gatherings where they are making a lot of dua, prayers, and stuff like that. And people have a spiritual side to them. And when we don't make efforts, anybody presenting spirituality to someone else is going to fall for it. And the vulnerabilities that they exploited in the Muslim world is number one, poverty, ignorance, and disease. So most Muslim majority countries are poor, sadly to say, even with all our resources. So they use that. They give free food, they give like free medicine to people. And at the time they're giving them, they'll be telling them about how magnificent and how praiseworthy Jesus Christ is, the Son of God, and stuff like that. And poverty is usually tied to ignorance, because when you're poor, you don't have time to acquire knowledge and stuff, and so you remain ignorant as well. And when that ignorance, when there's no one to teach them about what Islam is, what Islam brings, um, they get attracted towards it, and then they start believing that he is Lord and Savior. And then there's disease, which is also a big problem. And when someone cures you of a disease, when someone helps you out, you naturally become more inclined to listen to them and be influenced by them. And these are the vulnerabilities that they have been exploiting then and now. So, how do we counter their efforts? Well, first of all, create awareness, awareness in your institutions, right? Awareness through DAWA activities, awareness through your welfare services, awareness through the media, improve Islamic education, like provide free education. So you don't have to give that to the Christian community. Provide it in your schools for free for a subsidized rate. Have your governments involved, do something about it. Create your own awqaf, your endowments, help fund that. And do the dawah work, and each one of us should be doing wherever we are, in cities or in villages, and take out time to actually go to those places, cut off from the rest of this civilization, and have them do what they're doing. Welfare services by Islamic organizations and governments, that's something that we should be doing. When you're going to provide them with free food, when you're going to provide them with the medicine that they need, they will automatically turn to you and not to some other organization, which can then influence them in the way they want. So these are some of the things that we can and should do as a community in order to make sure that our brothers and sisters are protected, their deen is protected, and our deen is also protected. And with that, we come to the end of today's class. If there are any questions, I would be happy to